The humid air clung to Detective Maria Rodriguez's skin as she stood outside the nondescript warehouse in East Los Angeles, watching the sunrise paint the city's skyline in muted shades of gold and orange. The morning of March 15th, 2023, marked the beginning of what would become one of the most extensive federal investigations into money laundering networks operating between Los Angeles and Miami. The operation, codenamed Golden Pipeline, would expose the intricate web of financial crimes that had been quietly flowing through American cities for years. The warehouse before her looked ordinary enough, surrounded by chain-link fences and graffiti-stained walls typical of the industrial district. But inside, federal agents had discovered something extraordinary, a sophisticated operation that had laundered over $50 million in drug proceeds using a network that stretched from the streets of Los Angeles to the financial centers of Miami and all the way to underground banking systems in China. Rodriguez adjusted her bulletproof vest and checked her watch. In less than an hour, coordinated raids would begin simultaneously across both coasts. The Drug Enforcement Administration had spent 18 months building this case, and today would determine whether years of surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover operations would finally dismantle what experts believed to be one of the most sophisticated money laundering networks ever discovered operating on American soil. The investigation had begun almost by accident. In the summer of 2022, a routine traffic stop in South Carolina had led to the arrest of a Chinese national named Li Tan, who was found carrying $200,000 in cash, 2 phones, and a laptop. What seemed like a simple drug money transport case quickly evolved into something much larger when federal agents realized they had stumbled upon a courier for an international money laundering ring that operated with the precision of a legitimate financial institution. If you're watching this story unfold, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing these important investigations to light. The network operated with remarkable efficiency. Drug sales on the streets of Los Angeles would generate enormous amounts of cash, creating a logistical nightmare for criminal organizations. Traditional methods of moving money across borders were slow, expensive, and increasingly monitored by federal authorities. But this new system changed everything. Chinese money laundering organizations had developed a service that could move funds faster, cheaper, and with a fraction of the usual fees charged by traditional criminal money laundering operations. The process was elegantly simple in concept, but devastatingly complex in execution. Cash generated from drug sales in Los Angeles would be collected by a network of couriers who operated like an informal banking system. These individuals, many of them Chinese nationals living in the United States, would accept the dirty money and credit the drug organization's account in what amounted to an underground financial network. The physical cash would then be integrated into legitimate businesses or used to purchase goods that would be shipped to China, while the drug organization would receive clean money through the Chinese banking system. Anne Milgram, the DEA administrator, would later describe these Chinese criminal money laundering networks as revolutionary in their approach. They could transfer funds more swiftly, at lower costs, and for a fraction of the usual fees. For the cartels, it was indeed a match made in heaven, as one former DEA agent with 3 decades of experience would characterize it. The global drug markets had effectively turned into an informal banking system for China. The investigation revealed that this wasn't just a Los Angeles problem. Similar networks were operating in Miami, where the warm, humid climate of South Florida provided the perfect cover for an entirely different approach to money laundering. While Los Angeles focused on cash collection and goods shipment, Miami specialized in trade-based money laundering, where legitimate-looking international commerce masked the movement of drug proceeds. In Miami's Port District, where container ships arrived daily from Latin America and Asia, investigators discovered that electronics and vaping devices had become the preferred vehicles for moving money. Companies with addresses in Colombia, Mexico, and the United States were purportedly involved in the wholesale acquisition of electronics and vaping devices from suppliers in China. The financial activity, which occurred between 2022 and 2024, showed U.S. bank accounts receiving cash deposits, checks, wire transfers, and peer-to-peer payments from numerous third parties that ultimately funded outgoing wire transfers to China-based companies. The sophistication of the operation became apparent when agents realized that the same individuals who were collecting cash in Los Angeles parking lots were connected to the import-export businesses, processing millions of dollars in transactions through Miami's financial institutions. It was a coast-to-coast network that treated the United States like a vast money laundering laboratory. Federal agent Sarah Chen had been tracking these networks for 3 years when the Golden Pipeline investigation officially began. Chen, a financial crime specialist with the DEA's newly formed illicit finance team, had noticed patterns in seemingly unrelated cases across multiple states. Chinese nationals were appearing in drug trafficking investigations with increasing frequency, but they weren't trafficking drugs. They were moving money, and they were doing it better than anyone had ever seen. The scope of the problem became clear when Chen's team mapped out the network's operations. In nearly every investigation involving cartels and money laundering, Chinese groups were implicated. The numbers were staggering. One Chinese national named Enhua Fang, operating from North Carolina, had allegedly run an incredibly active cell that made over 100 cash deposits totaling more than $17 million in banks from Georgia to Virginia. The financial flows revealed a criminal ecosystem that spanned continents. Drug organizations in Mexico would coordinate with distribution networks in the United States, knowing that Chinese money laundering organizations would handle the complex task of repatriating their profits. The system was so efficient that it had begun to transform how international drug trafficking operated. In Los Angeles, the physical infrastructure of money laundering looked remarkably unremarkable. Strip malls in San Gabriel Valley housed businesses that appeared to be legitimate import-export companies, currency exchanges, and small retail operations. But behind their ordinary facades, these businesses were processing millions of dollars in drug proceeds. Couriers would arrive at predetermined times, carrying duffel bags and backpacks filled with cash. The money would disappear into the business, and within hours, electronic transfers would begin flowing to bank accounts across the Pacific. The investigation took a dramatic turn in early 2024 when federal agents, using drug-sniffing dogs, stopped Li Tan on a highway in South Carolina. The discovery of $200,000 in cash in his vehicle was just the beginning. Analysis of his phones and laptop revealed communications with a network of individuals across the United States who were all part of the same money laundering operation. The digital evidence painted a picture of an organization that operated with the discipline and coordination of a multinational corporation. Tan, investigators learned, was just one courier in a network that extended from China to Belize and throughout the United States. He and his associates would traverse the country collecting proceeds from drug sales, taking a percentage for themselves, and then using bank accounts in both the United States and abroad to launder the funds. The operation was so sophisticated that it included backup systems, alternative routes, and contingency plans for every aspect of the money movement process. The Miami connection became apparent when investigators traced wire transfers from Los Angeles-based accounts to companies operating in South Florida. These companies appeared to be engaged in legitimate international trade, importing electronics and consumer goods from Asia and exporting products to Latin America. But the financial patterns told a different story. The timing and amounts of transactions corresponded perfectly with drug seizures and arrests in Los Angeles, suggesting that the Miami operations were directly connected to West Coast drug sales. The trade-based money laundering schemes leveraged the enormous consumer demand for electronics, including cellular phones and vaping devices. Companies would place orders for goods from Chinese suppliers, pay for them with drug proceeds, and then sell the goods in Latin American markets. The profits from these sales would be distributed to drug organizations through the Chinese underground banking system, completing a complex cycle that effectively laundered millions of dollars while creating the appearance of legitimate international commerce. Federal prosecutors began to piece together indictments that would ultimately charge 24 individuals with participating in a money laundering conspiracy. The charges represented years of investigative work that had required coordination between the DEA, IRS, Homeland Security investigations, and other federal agencies. The complexity of the financial schemes meant that traditional drug enforcement techniques were insufficient. Agents had to become financial analysts, learning to trace electronic transfers, analyze trade data, and understand the intricacies of international banking regulations. The investigation revealed that Chinese money laundering organizations had several advantages over their competitors from Colombia and other regions. They offered lower fees, had established networks throughout the Chinese diaspora in the United States and Latin America, and could leverage China's position as a global manufacturing hub to create legitimate-appearing trade relationships. These organizations had effectively industrialized money laundering, turning it from a risky criminal service into a reliable business operation. The human cost of these networks became apparent as investigators interviewed community members in both Los Angeles and Miami. In neighborhoods where these operations were concentrated, residents described a climate of fear and silence. Businesses that might have been legitimate were suspected of criminal activity, creating an atmosphere of distrust. Family members who had immigrated from China found themselves under suspicion simply because of their ethnicity and business connections. In Los Angeles' San Gabriel Valley, where many Chinese-American businesses operated, community leaders reported that federal investigations had created a chilling effect on legitimate commerce. Business owners were afraid to accept cash payments or engage in international trade, fearing that normal business activities might be misinterpreted as money laundering. The psychological impact of the criminal networks extended far beyond the individuals directly involved in the schemes. Miami's international business community faced similar challenges. The city's role as a gateway for trade with Latin America meant that many legitimate businesses engaged in the same types of transactions that money launderers used to move criminal proceeds. Import-export companies found themselves subject to increased scrutiny, and some reported that banks had closed their accounts due to concerns about money laundering risks. The investigation culminated in June 2024, when federal prosecutors announced charges against 24 individuals suspected of participating in schemes that laundered over $50 million in drug proceeds. The announcement represented one of the most substantial seizures to date in federal efforts to target Chinese money laundering operations. 2 individuals named in the indictment had been apprehended, one by Chinese authorities and the other by Mexican law enforcement, representing a notable achievement in international cooperation. The complexity of prosecuting these cases became apparent in courtrooms across California and Florida. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were engaged in legitimate business activities and that the government was criminalizing normal financial transactions. The cases required prosecutors to explain complex financial schemes to juries who might not understand the difference between legitimate international trade and sophisticated money laundering operations. Expert witnesses testified about the economic impact of money laundering networks, explaining how these operations distorted legitimate markets and provided essential services to drug trafficking organizations. The networks weren't just moving money, they were enabling the entire fentanyl trade that was devastating American communities. Every dollar that flowed through these systems represented drugs that would ultimately reach American streets. The investigation also revealed the technological sophistication of modern money laundering operations. The networks used encrypted communications, digital currencies, and sophisticated financial instruments to move money across borders. They employed professionals with expertise in international banking, trade finance, and regulatory compliance. These weren't street-level criminals. They were white-collar professionals who had chosen to apply their skills to criminal enterprises. The federal response to these networks required a fundamental shift in how law enforcement approached drug trafficking investigations. Traditional methods that focused on arresting street-level dealers and seizing drugs were insufficient when facing organizations that could quickly replace arrested individuals and seized assets. The focus had to shift to disrupting the financial infrastructure that made large-scale drug trafficking possible. The DEA formed a new team focused specifically on illicit finance, recognizing that the increasing overlap between cartels and money laundering activities required specialized expertise. This team, composed of approximately 25 individuals drawn from existing units focused on cartels, allowed the DEA to uncover money laundering networks that were previously unknown. The approach represented a fundamental change in drug enforcement strategy, acknowledging that following the money was often more effective than following the drugs. Parallel efforts by other federal agencies complemented the DEA's work. Homeland Security investigations established a cross-border financial crime center in Washington, D.C., to share intelligence with other enforcement agencies and financial institutions about Chinese money laundering and associated threats. The center was specifically designed to combat the tactic of using fraudulent but convincing Chinese passports to open bank accounts in the United States. The Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network issued advisories urging financial institutions to be vigilant in detecting the use of Chinese money laundering networks by Mexico-based drug cartels. These advisories provided specific indicators that banks could use to identify suspicious transactions, including unusual patterns of cash deposits, wire transfers to certain geographic regions, and trade transactions that didn't align with normal business practices. The investigation also highlighted significant challenges in the federal government's approach to combating money laundering. Despite the creation of new specialized units and task forces, there was no centralized command that consolidated the efforts of all involved federal agencies. Different agencies had different priorities, different methods, and different measures of success. The lack of coordination sometimes led to duplicated efforts or missed opportunities to develop cases. The scope of Chinese money laundering activities in the United States remained largely unknown, even to federal officials. When asked to estimate the total amount of money being laundered through these networks, senior officials from the Treasury Department, DEA, and other agencies acknowledged that they simply didn't have reliable data. The inadequate and rudimentary nature of the enforcement structure made it difficult to develop a comprehensive understanding of the problem. FBI Director Christopher Wray informed the U.S. Senate that the FBI was investigating over 350 cases linked to cartel leadership, with 91 of those cases occurring along the southern border. However, federal agencies couldn't provide specific information about how many of these cases involved Chinese money launderers collaborating with cartels. The lack of data highlighted the need for better intelligence collection and analysis capabilities. The legislative response to these challenges included proposals to close loopholes in U.S. law that money launderers were exploiting. Senators from both parties introduced bills that would strengthen reporting requirements for certain types of financial transactions, increase penalties for money laundering offenses, and provide additional resources for federal agencies investigating these crimes. However, the complexity of the financial schemes meant that regulatory responses often lagged behind criminal innovations. The international dimensions of the money laundering networks created additional challenges for law enforcement. Coordination with Chinese authorities was complicated by diplomatic tensions and different legal systems. While Chinese authorities had cooperated in some cases, including the arrest of individuals named in U.S. indictments, the level of cooperation was inconsistent and often dependent on broader diplomatic relationships. Mexican cooperation was similarly complex. While Mexican authorities had arrested some individuals wanted by U.S. prosecutors, Mexico's own challenges with corruption and cartel influence meant that law enforcement cooperation was often limited. The money laundering networks operated across borders with impunity, while law enforcement agencies were constrained by jurisdictional limitations and diplomatic considerations. The investigation revealed that money laundering networks had evolved far beyond traditional methods. The use of cryptocurrency, digital payment systems, and sophisticated financial instruments made it increasingly difficult for law enforcement to track the flow of criminal proceeds. The networks could move money through multiple jurisdictions and financial systems faster than investigators could trace the transactions. The psychological warfare aspect of these operations became apparent through interviews with community members and business owners. The networks relied on fear and intimidation to maintain their operations, creating communities where legitimate businesses were afraid to report suspicious activities and residents were reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement. This climate of fear was as important to the network's success as their financial sophistication. The impact on local communities extended beyond fear and intimidation. The presence of money laundering operations distorted local economies, creating artificial demand for certain types of businesses and real estate. Properties that might have been used for legitimate purposes were instead used as fronts for criminal operations. The economic distortions made it difficult to distinguish between legitimate economic activity and criminal enterprises. The human stories behind the investigation revealed the personal costs of these criminal networks. Family members who had immigrated to the United States seeking legitimate opportunities found themselves caught up in criminal investigations. Some had been recruited into money laundering operations through promises of easy money, only to discover that they were participating in schemes that facilitated drug trafficking and violence. The investigation also revealed the global nature of modern organized crime. The networks connected drug producers in Mexico with chemical suppliers in China, money launderers in Los Angeles and Miami, and consumers throughout the United States. The criminal organizations operated like multinational corporations with specialized divisions, professional management, and sophisticated logistics operations. The financial analysis conducted during the investigation showed that money laundering fees had become a significant source of revenue for criminal organizations. The networks weren't just providing a service to drug traffickers, They were profiting substantially from the money movement operations. Some organizations were generating more revenue from money laundering than from drug trafficking itself. The technological arms race between criminals and law enforcement became apparent throughout the investigation. As law enforcement developed new methods for tracking financial transactions, criminal organizations developed new methods for evading detection. The use of encrypted communications, digital currencies, and sophisticated financial instruments meant that investigations required increasingly specialized expertise and resources. The sentencing phase of the prosecutions provided insights into the personal motivations of individuals who participated in money laundering networks. Some defendants claimed they were unaware of the criminal nature of their activities, believing they were engaged in legitimate financial services. Others acknowledged their participation but argued that economic desperation had driven them to criminal activity. The investigation's conclusion marked both an end and a beginning. While federal prosecutors had successfully dismantled one major money laundering network, they acknowledged that other networks continued to operate. The arrests and convictions sent a message to criminal organizations that money laundering operations weren't invisible to law enforcement, but they also revealed the enormous scope of the problem. The lessons learned from the Golden Pipeline investigation influenced law enforcement strategy nationwide. Federal agencies began incorporating financial analysis into drug trafficking investigations from the beginning, rather than treating money laundering as a separate issue. Training programs were developed to help agents understand complex financial schemes and international banking regulations. The investigation also highlighted the importance of community engagement in combating money laundering. Law enforcement agencies began working more closely with community leaders, business associations, and immigrant advocacy groups to build trust and encourage reporting of suspicious activities. The approach recognized that community cooperation was essential for identifying and disrupting criminal networks. The international cooperation aspects of the investigation set precedents for future cases. The successful arrests of individuals by Chinese and Mexican authorities demonstrated that effective coordination was possible despite diplomatic challenges. These successes provided models for future international cooperation efforts. The regulatory responses to the investigation included new guidance for financial institutions on identifying suspicious transactions related to money laundering. Banks and other financial service providers were given specific indicators to watch for, including unusual cash deposit patterns, wire transfers to certain geographic regions, and trade transactions that didn't align with normal business practices. The investigation revealed that the fight against money laundering required sustained effort and resources. Criminal organizations were constantly adapting their methods, requiring law enforcement to continuously update their approaches. The networks that were dismantled during the Golden Pipeline investigation were quickly replaced by new operations that learned from their predecessors' mistakes. The broader implications of the investigation extended to national security concerns. Money laundering networks that facilitated drug trafficking could also be used for other criminal purposes, including terrorism financing and sanctions evasion. The infrastructure that moved drug proceeds could potentially be used to move money for other criminal or hostile activities. The economic analysis conducted during the investigation showed that money laundering operations had significant impacts on legitimate financial markets. The injection of criminal proceeds into legal economic activities created artificial demand and distorted market prices. These distortions made it more difficult for legitimate businesses to compete and for regulators to understand market dynamics. As Detective Rodriguez watched the sun set over Los Angeles on the final day of the coordinated arrests, She reflected on the complexity of the case that had consumed her life for nearly 2 years. The Golden Pipeline investigation had successfully dismantled a major money laundering network, but it had also revealed the enormous scope of criminal financial activity operating within American communities. The network that federal agents had spent months investigating represented just one branch of a global criminal economy that moved billions of dollars annually. The sophistication of the operations, the international connections, and the integration with legitimate businesses made it clear that traditional law enforcement approaches were insufficient for addressing modern organized crime. The investigation had shown that money laundering networks were not just a law enforcement problem, but a community safety issue that affected neighborhoods throughout Los Angeles and Miami. The climate of fear and suspicion created by these operations damaged social cohesion and economic development in affected communities. The psychological impact extended far beyond the individuals directly involved in criminal activities. The successful prosecution of the Golden Pipeline case provided a template for future investigations, but it also highlighted the resources and expertise required to combat sophisticated financial crimes. The coordination between multiple federal agencies, the international cooperation with foreign law enforcement, and the complex financial analysis required specialized capabilities that were not available in all jurisdictions. The case files that would eventually fill dozens of boxes contained evidence of a criminal enterprise that had operated with remarkable efficiency and sophistication. But they also contained stories of communities affected by crime, families torn apart by criminal prosecutions, and legitimate businesses damaged by association with criminal activities. The human cost of money laundering networks extended far beyond the financial crimes themselves. The lessons learned from the investigation would influence law enforcement strategy for years to come. The recognition that following the money was often more effective than following the drugs represented a fundamental shift in drug enforcement philosophy. The integration of financial analysis into criminal investigations from the beginning, rather than as an afterthought, would become standard practice for major cases. The international cooperation aspects of the case set important precedents for future investigations. The successful coordination with Chinese and Mexican authorities demonstrated that effective law enforcement cooperation was possible despite diplomatic challenges and different legal systems. These successes provided models that could be replicated in other cases. The community impact of the investigation would be felt long after the courtroom proceedings concluded. The revelation that major money laundering networks had operated in Los Angeles and Miami neighborhoods created lasting concerns about the infiltration of criminal organizations into legitimate communities. The challenge of distinguishing between legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises would continue to affect these communities. The regulatory and legislative responses to the investigation included new requirements for financial institutions, enhanced penalties for money laundering offenses, and additional resources for law enforcement agencies. However, the complexity of modern financial systems and the adaptability of criminal organizations meant that the regulatory response would need to be constantly updated to address new threats. The Golden Pipeline investigation marked a significant victory in the fight against money laundering, but it also revealed the enormous scope of the challenge facing law enforcement. The networks that were dismantled represented just a fraction of the criminal financial activity operating within the United States. The investigation's success provided hope that sophisticated criminal organizations could be defeated, but it also highlighted the sustained effort and resources required to protect American communities from these threats. The morning after the final arrests, as federal agents processed evidence and began preparing for trials, the streets of Los Angeles and Miami looked no different than they had before the investigation began. But beneath the surface, a major criminal network had been disrupted, and the message had been sent to other criminal organizations that money laundering operations were not beyond the reach of American law enforcement. The investigation had shown that the fight against organized crime in the 21st century required new approaches, new capabilities, and new forms of cooperation. The networks that moved criminal proceeds across continents and through multiple financial systems could only be defeated by law enforcement agencies that were equally sophisticated and equally international in their approach. As the sun rose on a new day in both Los Angeles and Miami, the communities that had been affected by money laundering networks began the long process of recovery. The investigation had removed a major criminal presence, but it had also revealed the vulnerability of American communities to sophisticated criminal organizations. The challenge of protecting these communities would require continued vigilance, continued cooperation, and continued commitment to justice. The Golden Pipeline investigation would be remembered as a landmark case in the fight against money laundering, but it would also be remembered as a reminder of the price of criminal infiltration into American communities. The networks that had been dismantled had operated for years without detection, affecting thousands of lives and distorting entire local economies. The investigation's success provided hope that these networks could be defeated, but it also served as a warning about the constant threat they posed to community safety and economic integrity.